At the last class session, I did a lecture on The Grand Illusion, the film, where I went into an extraordinary amount of depth, talking about what happens in the film, how to interpret it, how to complete this essay assignment. If I get all of your attention, even yours. Thank you. Okay. And this was the content of that essay. That lecture is now posted online, and you can also see on the webcast me presenting this lecture. And I highly, highly advise that you study this lecture very closely as you complete your essay. I'm not going to redo this lecture because for those of you that were here on Thursday, I mean, it was pretty rough, right? It was not fun. But I highly advise that you go through this so that you know everything that you're supposed to do in order to kick butt on this essay. All right, so this is cool. We went through all the characters. Okay, really quick, I want to do this one more time. Which one is the heartthrob French actor from the early 20th century? That's right, it's Captain von Rauffenstein. That's right. Who's actually Erich von Stroheim, also a German director. Okay, who did a 4-hour film called Greed that's silent and black and white, which we'll be watching next week. And I'm sure you'll all be excited for that. And is also supposedly one of the best films of all time and all that. So, okay, so here's the prompt for the essay. Just to recap, again, this is the third time. I want you to identify 3 bases of group difference, 3 group differences in the film The Grand Illusion, and explain how each of these group differences either is or is not transcended in the film. So these are some examples of ways you could make that argument. And then I want you to use a concept or a piece of research from class at some point in your essay. And so a really good way to do that would be to look at the social identity theory lecture, which we started on Thursday and we'll finish today. Go through there and look at the ways in which, who knows what's going on with the technology here. Go through there and look at the ways in which identity differences are transcended, the ways in which overarching identities get activated. And that would be a really good way to take some class material and apply it to this to this essay, because you're supposed to identify 3 group differences and then explain whether they are or not transcended. And a really good use of course material would be to identify an overarching identity that's being invoked, how it's invoked, and how that is a way in which group differences are overcome. Some other things, since you haven't got the last essay back, you may be wondering, wow, how did I do on the last essay? I don't know. Well, I don't want to read off all your grades because that would take a while. Instead, I'll try and give you some general feedback. In general, performance on the previous essay, the Cool Hand Luke essay, was heavily bifurcated. Now, that's a fancy word, right? There's your 25-cent word for the day. What does bifurcated mean? It means that the distribution of grades was bimodal. Okay, that's clearer now, right? It basically means if we were to graph the distribution of grades in terms of how many, A's and B's and C's there were, there'd be a big bunch of grades that were A's, A minuses, A's, A pluses, and then a big bunch of grades that were like C pluses, C's, and C minuses. So that's bimodal, bifurcated distribution, bi. There's just 2 parts to this distribution of grades. So what's the story on that? What was the difference between the people who did really, really well and the people who didn't do so well? The big difference, I would say, is organization. And I mean this in a few ways. Basically, if you wanted to be in the group with that got A's, you would want to make a really clear argument, punctuated and clearly conveyed through a simple 1 to 2 sentence thesis statement that's super clear and understandable. It could be a complex idea. It could be a nuanced idea. That would be great. But it should be very clearly conveyed, very simply stated so that we can get it, even if the content of those sentences, that sentence or 2 sentences, is actually complicated. So you'd have a simple, straightforward argument, simply presented argument, and then you would clearly support it with evidence from the film. From the Cool Hand Luke film. And that would be the best way to do well in The Grand Illusion as well. So what you want to do is follow closely to the 5-paragraph essay style, which says you have an introductory paragraph, and in that introductory paragraph, at some point is a thesis statement, and that this isn't necessarily required of the structure, but I would highly advise it to have a sentence after the thesis statement that says, here's how I'm going to support my thesis statement, which then directs me to the body paragraphs that come next, wherein you support your thesis statement with at least 3 bodies of evidence or in the grand illusion essay example, 3 bases of group difference. And then you return in the final paragraph and basically redo the first paragraph. Don't plagiarize yourself. Don't write the exact same paragraph, but more or less write the same paragraph. Restate your thesis, explain briefly how it was you supported it, and then give some florid, beautiful sentence that makes your essay seem to speak to the meaning of life. Okay? That's the way it's done. I remember when I was 14, I'd be writing these things, and I'd sit there and I'd like puzzle, like, man, how am I going to make this essay about Oliver Twist seem to just, you know, jump off the page? And I wrote some pretty hilarious sentences. So the way to do well is follow these instructions, be organized, I think a lot of people go to college and they start reading fancy collegiate texts, and I don't mean to be patronizing here, but this is my experience. I was like, wow, these are some fancy texts I'm supposed to be reading. And they think the way to write a smart essay or to write smart is to write in language that confuses the reader, you know? And you would be forgiven for thinking that, because sometimes that seems to be what people are doing to you. But actually, the best way to write smart is to take a clever, smart idea and convey it simply and straightforward. And don't be afraid to baldly state your argument. Don't be afraid of that. It took me like 20 years of schooling to figure out that I needed to put all the work into conceptualizing my argument and then just write it in a very straightforward fashion. I had spent all these years trying to write these florid, full, beautiful sentences with lots of extra clauses and all that stuff, and you're only irritating the people evaluating your essay, you know? I didn't realize this until I had to start reading essays, and then it was all like, hence, heretofore, whence, for, thus, since, as much, you know, it's so frustrating, these sentences that start with that, you know, and have the endless clauses and the parentheticals and your dashes, and, you know, if you can do that and simply state your argument and reason for it, that's awesome. But you can get lost in these clauses and these because, whence, for, herewith, forwithal, thence as much. So inasmuch as heretofore, therefore, inasmuch, I think it's okay to say some of them, like however. That's handy. However is a useful, transition. You're going to say the opposite, and it cues the reader, I'm about to make the opposite argument, Or because, very useful, very useful. What else? No, that's about it. No. Therefore and thus. Those are useful, too, because they're sort of saying, I'm going to bring something out that's implied by the prior sentence or 2 sentences. But that's about it, If you're using henceforth, wherewithal, no, wherewithal doesn't count. Anyway, don't, please, God. Okay. And in your writing, remember, there's a great Ernest Hemingway quote. Ernest Hemingway wrote in A Movable Feast that his goal when he wrote was to write one true sentence. And if you've ever read Hemingway, you know that what he meant by one true sentence was not, leaping, florid prose, like an 18th century writer from Britain might have written or something like that, but rather a simple, bald statement with no embellishment, hardly any adjectives. He tried to write beautifully with his nouns, He tried to just tell you about a scene that was beautiful and tell it clearly and simply and boldly in such a way to where you got it because the substance of what he's saying is actually beautiful, not the way he says it. And so if you can get out of the way of your ideas, you'll write better and people will appreciate your writing better. And you'll put your time and energy into the stuff that matters, which is coming up with a smart argument. And this is a style of writing that's useful for getting a job with a writing component, which almost all of you, you'll have college degrees, you'll be getting jobs where you'll be expected to write. It's useful for getting that kind of job. It's useful for getting into graduate school because you have to take an analytical writing test at some point to get into graduate school. And then finally, it's useful for getting a good grade on this exam. So at the very least, it's the right way to do it for here and now. Okay, so specifically, you should review this. This is me indicating this. You should review this lecture PowerPoint. It's in the lecture PowerPoint slides section on B-Space, and I think it's pretty thorough. Okay, are there any questions before we go back to talking about social identity theory? Sunny. I know some of your names now, by the way. Yes. No, that's not your name. Yeah, okay. Damn. Classic fool. Damn. That's the last time I'll use somebody's name in class. Hey, how's it going, Sunny? I see you here, yeah. She's somewhere else. Were you here last Thursday? We went through this on Thursday. I apologize for the font. Now I don't feel so bad for calling you Sonny. Are you supposed to choose 3? Okay. Well, okay. So it's when I say present 3 group differences, what am I talking about? Or that's how I'll translate your question. So a way to do that would be to pick like 3 of these, not 3 of the examples of one of them. Do you know what I mean? Like 3 general group differences, like the difference between nobility and peasants, the difference between rich and poor, the difference between soldiers and officers, and then give 1 example of each one, or more if you'd like. Do you know what I mean? Okay, cool. It's an excellent question. The question was, did you want 1 general basis of group difference and 3 examples of it, or 3 group differences and then at least 1 example of each? The latter. I want 3 group differences and then examples of each. It's a good question. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yeah. Is it possible to get the Cool and Luke grades before before Thursday? No, it's not. We'll get them back to you on Thursday, which is as fast as we can really do it. Yeah. No, we can't. The grades aren't totally in yet. Though I don't mind you asking. All right. Other questions? You'll get them back to you as soon as humanly possible, or we will get them back to you as soon as humanly possible. Any other questions? Okay. And don't forget, if you want to do extremely well in this essay, you will need to not forget to use a concept from class at some point. So be sure to do that. And then review this online if you want. Change the color of the font as you read it on your computer and so on. I understand the gripe there. It's a valid one. Okay. So, all right. This actually worked. Okay, good. Okay. Why? Okay. We were talking about this computer system is completely broken down on me. Okay. When we left off on Thursday to talk about the grand illusion, we were talking about social identity theory and intergroup conflict. And social identity theory is a big theory which offers many insights on the nature of intergroup conflict. It's a theory from psychology, from psychological social psychology, but it's actually very social. I've told you up to now that one of the big differences between psychological social psychology and sociological social psychology is that psychological social psychology, so social psychologists who are in psychology, they're interested in a lower level of analysis. When they go to explain something, they tend to think in cognitive terms or neural terms or maybe even genetic terms, whereas sociologists, they are more interested in higher levels of analysis. So when they do social psychology, they're very likely to say this is how it speaks to general social patterns or general social issues like discrimination or poverty or something like that. Whereas psychologists, when they're doing their social psychology, they're likely to say, here's the cognitive mechanism that drives this effect, and an anchor and adjustment or something like that, or focalism. Social identity theory is both an example of this difference and an exception. It's an exception in that it's a psychological theory of intergroup processes wherein we speak to the dynamics and relations between groups. So in that way, it's sort of turning up in levels of analysis. But one thing that's cool about it is that it also has, part of its meat lies at a lower level of analysis in fundamental observations about cognition. And we'll get to that in a second. So actually, we're going to get to that like right friggin' now. So, okay. So people have a natural cognitive tendency to categorize when they see contrast. And this is social identity theory's sort of fundamental principle. Its first idea is you wouldn't even know that there was something unless you'd seen its opposite. So you wouldn't know there was night unless you'd seen day, and you wouldn't know that there was a city if you hadn't seen the countryside. And likewise, you wouldn't know that you were a Cal student if there weren't other universities that we could identify against, or that at least make it clear that we're not just university students. Do you know what I mean? Okay, so contrast is critical to the development of groups, group identification, and solidarity. So Okay, so we talked about some of the bases of group identification, the kinds of people that we tend to identify with. We tend to identify with similar others, and then we identify against those that we see as dissimilar, and that's the kind of basic ingredients of group formation. Perceived similarity, also the presence of a dissimilar outgroup, and then also situations can make bases of group difference salient or not. Now, what is salient? It means it's at the front of your mind, it's on your mind. When something's salient, it's active in your brain. Okay, and then consequences of group identification include outgroup animosity and in-group favoritism, and that's all I'm going to talk about in this class. Another thing we talked about was overarching identities. And overarching identities are things that can be triggered, which will then bring groups that had previously been distinct and maybe identifying against one another together. And the principles of bringing groups together is not that different than the principles that drive them apart. So overarching identities can be activated, and they'll reduce in-group identification. How are they activated? Well, in this class, we will highlight 3 ways. One way is by having a common enemy. When two groups that identified as distinct, and maybe even identified in opposition to one another, when they perceive themselves to have some common enemy, then they'll tend to see this as some basis to merge their groups. So a great example would be Japan and Germany in World War II had nothing really in common. Germany even had racial codes that would derogate the very fiber of the Japanese and call them inferior. But then they had a common enemy in the United States and the Allies in general, and so they wound up teaming up together. Germany rewrote their racial codes to make the Japanese Aryan, just like them, and they lived happily ever after for like 4 years or something. So a second way in which overarching identities can be triggered, which bring groups together, is by seeing some significant similarity. And this is about the same principles as what makes groups to begin with, right? And you can probably think of some examples of this in your head right now. And then I'm not going to give them to you because you can think of them on your own. Yeah, that's how teaching works. And then a third one is by having and working towards some common goal. And here I mentioned the now defunct white cop, black cop, buddy cop genre, like Lethal Weapon, 48 Hours, a bunch of films you've never seen because you're younger than I am. But perhaps you remember Shanghai Nights or whatever, Noon. Shanghai Noon and the sequel Shanghai Nights, which were actually pretty good when Owen Wilson was still like pretty funny. Okay. Okay, it's kind of one note, you know. It's kind of been the same joke for 10 years, you know. Okay, so as you work towards some common goal, you tend to come together across bases of group difference. Okay, so now in the social identity theory lecture in the material, we're going to talk about 5 studies, actually 6 studies, that give evidence for the dynamics of social identity theory, that will cast some sort of more specific light on how social identity theory works. And at this time, I want to remind you of the 3 levels of learning that we emphasize in the class. Theory, you know, ideas, which we've just reviewed the basic ideas of social identity theory. Empirical data and examples and support, examples that help you see the ideas in a more concrete way, and then the application of these ideas to your everyday life. And you can do some of that in your head as we go along here. Okay, so study 1 is one of the first actually it is the first social identity theory study, and it was on the accentuation effect. And the purpose of this study was to understand the effect of category membership on perceptions and behavior. And this was, I think, yeah, definitely the first social identity theory experiment. And this guy, Henri Tajfeld, was the guy who conducted it in 1959, and then a follow-up study in 1963. And here's how that experiment worked. What they did was they brought experimental participants into a lab environment, and they presented them with 2 sets of objects, just kind of random objects like a rubber ball, some paper, I'm making this up. Paper clips. I'm thinking of objects here. I don't know. This could get weird. A hammer, okay? And they're looking at sets of physical objects. And these physical objects are presented in 2 different ways depending on the condition of the experiment. So in condition 1, the objects are divided into 2 sets, and they're presented as separate groups. They say, look at these objects in group A and group B and study them closely. In condition 2, the objects are presented in the exact same way on a table, but they're not identified as being in different groups. They don't say group A, group B. They just say, look at these objects. They're arranged on the table in exactly the same way, kind of clustered into two groups, but they don't identify them as being in two different groups. And then they asked the subjects to rate the similarity of the physical objects. So they'd say, how similar is the hammer to the rubber ball? How similar is the rubber ball to the stack of paper? And so on. And what they found was that people tended to perceive greater similarity within the sets that were presented as being groups and less similarity between the sets that were presented as groups. So when you present these two clusters of objects on this table as being group A and group B, people will then tend to say, oh, the stuff in group A is pretty similar to the other stuff in group A, and it's really different from all this shit in group B. But if you don't do that, then they don't do it as much. Is this clear? Okay. So the idea here is the accentuation effect, that mere presentation of stimuli, not even human beings, just objects, can lead to an exaggerated perception of homogeneity within sets and difference between sets. Just presenting them as being in different groups can facilitate that. Okay. So obviously what they're talking about, they're social psychologists, so they're not interested in the perception of objects. They just wanted to use the objects as proxies for any stimulus. So what they're talking about here is the categorization of people. And they think that the categorization of people generates a very similar accentuation effect. That when you're presented with some group of people, you'll tend to say, oh, they're pretty similar because they're in a group, and you'll tend to see great dissimilarity between them. So I don't know anything about the people who go to the University of Oregon and people who go to the University of Oregon State, except that neither is as good as us at football. But I, in my head, kind of assume the people that go to the University of Oregon are similar kinds of people. I'm sure that's not true at all, but they're probably a really diverse group of people. But in my head, they're all people who go to the University of Oregon. And people who go to Oregon State, they're all kind of similar. And in my head, these two groups of people have nothing in common, right? But this is, of course, not true, right? These are not particularly different people. They're just people who went to one school versus the other. They're probably really, really similar. And if they weren't presented to you as different groups, you probably wouldn't even differentiate them at all. So the accentuation effect is considered to be part of the cognitive basis of outgroup stereotyping. When we tend to think of people in that other group as being all like one another and all really different from our group, it's because of the accentuation effect. Because of the sheer presentation of people in groups will tend to do this cognitively. And this, actually, every year people ask me what the heck this picture is. It's a picture of people in Halloween outfits. So like Halloween outfits, they tend to use stereotypes where they exaggerate the characteristics of some group. It's kind of a stretch. It's kind of a stretch, but it's better than no picture at all. I would argue. Maybe it's not. Okay. Study 2. So study 1 is about how presentation of people in groups, or really any stimulus for that matter, tends to lead to the perception that the groups are homogeneous, so the people are similar within them, and that the groups are different from one another, even when there's no social content to that group differentiation. So study 2 is about how those simple group differences, again, almost meaningless, tiny group differences between people can cue social motives and intergroup competition and favoritism, which is one of the things I told you group identification leads to, in-group favoritism and derogation of outgroups. So this is a study that was also conducted by Henri Tajfeld in 1970, and this is how it went. Participants were 14 or 15 years old. They were from Bristol, United Kingdom, so they were from England. And the participants were put into 3-person groups. And so 2 other group members were differentiated on some trivial criterion, painting preference. So what they did was they gave you a test. They give you, if you're a participant in this study, if you're a participant in this study, you'd be given a bunch of paintings to look at and evaluate. And they'd either be a bunch of paintings by Paul Klee, who's a nice artist, or a bunch of paintings by Vasily Kandinsky, who's a better artist. I'm just kidding. You can't prove that. Okay. So, and then what they'd ask you, if you were a subject in the study, they'd say, which one do you prefer? And you'd say which one you preferred. And then regardless of your statement, what they do is they put you in a group with one person who has your painting preference and another person who doesn't. because they're interested in, will you treat somebody who has the same painting preference as you better or differently than someone who doesn't have the same painting preference than you? Even though this shouldn't matter, right? Like what painting you like doesn't reflect your moral fiber. It doesn't reflect who you are, where you came from. Not when they're both abstract expressionist artists, right? I think they're both abstract. Anyway, whatever they are. They're both really modern artists, so it shouldn't really mean anything. So participants were told in the study to distribute money between themselves and others, and the only thing they knew about the other people was their group membership, like which painting they had preferred. And the subjects in the study are given 3 allocation schemes to pick from. They have to pick one of these 3 ways to allocate resources between themselves and the other 2 people. One of the ways was maximum joint profit. This was the way to give everybody the most total resources, and it involved giving resources out equally to all 3 people. Another one was maximum profit for the in-group. This one involves slightly higher payoffs for the in-group and then slightly worse payoffs for the out-group than the maximum joint profit. So if you really, really preferred your in-group, you'd pick this one, right? Because you're going to make a little more money, and then the out-group will do worse, but what do you care or whatever. And then another one was maximum difference between the in and the out groups. So in this one, the in-group doesn't make quite as much as here, the maximum profit for the in-group, but there's a big difference between them and the out-group. So this would be like a competitive payoff. If you want to defeat the other group, you might pick this one in order to treat them as badly as possible and maximize the difference between you and them. Are these payoff schemes clear, more or less? Okay, so there's 3. This one's equal and is high joint profit for the 2 of you and the 1 out-group person. This one, the 2 of you in the in-group make more, and the out-group person makes less. This one, the 2 of you don't make as much as here, but the out-group does very poorly, so you're doing way better than them. Yes? It seems kind of silly. They're testing a theory, social identity theory. There's nothing silly about that. Science. When Galileo dropped balls from the Eiffel Tower, did you say, or, no, I'm just making that up, Tower of Pisa, Leaning Tower of Pisa, which you didn't do, but did you call that silly? You didn't, did you? Because it was science. Is that not fair? I don't think it's kind of fair. I don't know. Okay, it seems silly. Your point is, what are these people thinking, right? They're in this very silly circumstance. Uh-huh. Yeah. 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 I mean, basically, yeah. Okay, so the question is, maybe I should get to this when I'm done presenting the study, but the question is, isn't this silly? Isn't this all silly? Isn't all of it ridiculous? And in a way it is. No, specifically, isn't it silly to bring these 14, 15-year-olds in and say, okay, what are your favorite paintings? Now give money to one another. And of course, that is very silly. I think the excuse for it is that though it's an artificial and weird situation, it is one that tests the theory very well. We're interested in whether the even tiny, tiny, trivial bases of group difference, this painting preference, will lead to favoritism even with valued resources. Like kids, they love money because money can be traded for candy. So you know that they care about the money. And so in that way, it's a nice test of this in-group favoritism, out-group derogation thing. And it's also very easy to measure. When you have money, you know exactly the amount that was allocated both ways, so you can measure it very tightly. Whereas if you were trying to say how much do they insult them, or how much do they belittle them, and when they speak about the in-group versus the out-group, that would be a little bit tougher to measure. You'd have to code it and all that stuff. That might be good, but it would be just a little bit tougher to do. So that's why they did it that way. What's the sacrifice? The sacrifice is maybe these subjects think the whole thing is weird and they don't act naturally because they find themselves in this artificial circumstance. Is this roughly something like the critique? Or?
I'm just asking, what they told them.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I take the critique to be, aren't they in this very strange, unnatural circumstance? And maybe they are. And so we should look across studies for demonstrations that are outside the lab, that are not in artificial circumstances, that are in more sort of fully realized, naturally occurring situations. We aren't worried that people are just acting weirdly or following some very strange instructions in the lab or something like that. And in a way, that's kind of the idea here is they thought they already saw the basic principles of intergroup conflict out in the field, and then they wanted to do an experiment to capture some of them. So that's my answer to that. Not necessarily the best answer to that. What instructions did they give them? I don't really remember. I have read this paper. It was a long time ago, though. Good question. Yes. It's not the same thing. So it's a good question. What's in between this and this? Maximum profit for the outgroup and maximum difference. So maximum profit for the in-group involves the in-group making more than in this condition, the maximum or this option of payment, maximum joint profit, and involves the outgroup doing a little bit worse. The maximum difference, I think the in-group makes the same as in this condition, not as much, or sorry, in this payment scheme, not as much in as in the maximum profit, but the outgroup does way, way worse. So let's say I have totally lost where you are, by the way, so I'm just speaking up. Okay, hey, how's it going? So let's say you, as a result of this painting preference thing, just love your in-group, and you don't even care about the out-group, really, but you're just like, oh, those of us who love Paul Klee, we deserve a lot of money. So you would pick the maximum profit for the in-group, and you wouldn't really care what the out-group got. If you, as a result of this painting preference, were like, man, Vasily Kandinsky is the man, and anybody who likes Paul Klee is an idiot, an inferior, not deserving of our money, and I need to demonstrate how much better we are than them, then you'd pick like a competitive payment scheme, one that maximizes the difference, that communicates I'm way better than you are. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this one maximizes the difference, and this one just maximizes profit for the in-group. Another question. Right. Were the kids forced to give out all their money? No. They were picking like three. I should just put the friggin' numbers up here. Why didn't I put the numbers up here? Okay. And I don't remember what they were. I read this paper like 8 years ago. So did the kids give out all the money? They didn't. In this payment schedule scheme, they give out all the money. The maximum joint profit, it's like 3 equal payments of $9.99 or whatever, And then in this one, there's less. This one involves less total payoff and more for the in-group and less for the out-group. This one is less still, but it maximizes the difference between in-group and out-group. Gosh, you guys are tough. I mean, really tough. Yes. Ooh, man. Getting clobbered. Yeah. Yes. So we're getting to that in like 2 weeks, though. So don't give away the ending. Yeah. Yeah. It is. No, it's a really good study too. We're going to talk about it in class. Yeah. I like that study a lot. I fit it into. Okay. Well, I'm not going to even. Okay. So the question is, isn't there this other study that's really awesome that's out in the field, outside the lab, that has similar findings, and isn't it awesome? And it is awesome. But we're going to get to it in like 2 weeks in the status section, I think, of the class. Because while I agree with you, it speaks to these dynamics for sure, I use it to communicate something else. So, yeah. Excellent question. We might also watch that film. It's a film called A Class Divided. How many people here have seen A Class Divided? Woo, yeah. It's a good film, right? It's a good film. Okay. So, what were the results of this study? This crazy, crazy study. Okay, so everyone would be best off with the maximum joint profit, but actually the participants favored maximum in-group profit, also known as MIP. And then this is, in general, their preferences, or this is like the rate at which, okay, so people pick this one the most, then this one next most, and then this one the least. So people favor, their favorite payoff was maximum in-group profit, giving the most resources to the in-group regardless of how much the out-group got. The next favorite was maximum difference, the competitive one, where the in-group doesn't even do as well as they would have in the maximum in-group profit one, but they do way better than the out-group. And then finally, pulling up the rear is the maximum profit for everybody, which is, the best way to just do right by everybody. But These kids were so obsessed with Vasily Kandinsky or Paul Klee, whoever they chose, that they put that one last. That was their least favorite, the one where everybody makes the most money, which is really, really interesting, I think. Partly because, I mean, what kind of kids in the 70s are that into Vasily Kandinsky or Paul Klee, you know? But, I mean, it's used as an example of the minimal group. It's called the minimal group paradigm, because it's the minimal conditions for making a group difference that people will attach significance to. Just your preferences on modern art paintings, even if you're friggin' 14 years old and presumably don't care that much about modern art, can trigger these sorts of dynamics. Yes, question? Are there maybe demand effects in the study? Is it the case that maybe these kids are intimidated by the experimenters, are kind of picking up on what they think the experimenters want them to do, and are therefore conforming to that? I have, I guess, three answers to that. One is maybe, and let's look at further evidence, for in-group favoritism in different settings and see if some of that will then eliminate that concern or address that concern. Because ultimately, no study's perfect, and I would never tell you that this study's perfect, but we would get closer to the truth across, several studies. A second answer would be, I would think it'd be just as likely that they'd think that they were being pressured to give the equal, most profitable to everybody outcome. In general, adults don't want you to be really mean to other kids that you play with. They're always telling you to stop beating up the other kids with like a truck or something, or whatever. This is obviously some flashback from my childhood coming out. So I would say they'd be just as likely to guess that they're being pressured to do the maximum joint profit. And then actually a third point, and this is really the best response to that question, and why I'm glad you asked the question, was this was originally a control condition. This was supposed to be a condition that didn't create group differences. They were actually interested in the original experiment, some other more meaningful way to create group differences. And then they were like, oh, we need a control condition with a basis of group difference that nobody will care about. So let's just use painting preferences. I mean, they're 14-year-old kids. What do they know about Vasily Kandinsky, right? I mean, I'm 31. What do I know about Vasily Kandinsky? So this was actually intended as a control condition, and then they found almost the same levels of in-group favoritism and out-group derogation in this setting. And so they were like, wow, this effect is stronger than we ever realized. And then Henri Tajfel did 35 more years of research on this because he stumbled on something great. So it really wasn't the pressure from the experimenters in that respect. If they were accurately guessing what the experimenters were thinking, the experimenters were thinking this won't create group differences. Yeah. So, Sonic. Has this research ever been conducted in communist or socialist or egalitarian country? I'm stealing your things. I don't know. It has been done in collectivist Asian societies. In fact, I collaborated with Toshio Yamagishi on a test of this in Japan, and the results were sort of muddy. But so basically, social identity theory works in Asia as well as in the U.S., though there's conflicting evidence on whether it works more or less. So, yeah. And I've tried to get a really rigorous answer to that exact question, but I've failed miserably. Which isn't Toshio's fault. That guy's really smart. Okay. So people were willing to forgo profits to deprive the outgroup in favoring the maximum difference versus the maximum joint profit. So in this one, the in-group makes less than here, but they actually pick it more because they get to make the outgroup make even less, like a very low payoff. And so these kids are being very mean to each other. They're like high art critics. It's like a fight, like a fist fight in the SF MoMA in this experiment. And I think we can all relate to that. So this experiment, or this setting, is called the minimal group setting, or the minimal group paradigm, because they found a minimal basis for creating in-group favoritism. There's barely any group differentiation going on in this study, and yet the kids really cling to it and take to it. So now you're thinking, Well, okay. So minimal group setting started originally as a control condition, but they discovered they could make groups out of almost nothing. Yes? It's an excellent question. So does this experiment suggest that humans have a natural tendency to see difference first rather than similarity? It may mean that. I would say it a little bit differently, which is that this experiment implies that humans attach surprisingly large significance to even small, trivial differences. If they saw two groups that were literally identical and equal, they probably wouldn't differentiate them. But even very small differences will be turned into significant ones subjectively in people's heads. A very similar point to your point. Yes. Did you say Willer said that? Did you say that? No. What did you say? I didn't. Can you repeat your question? I thought you said that I said something in another class. That's okay. That's complicated. Okay, so the question was, hasn't there been research showing that in-group versus out-group differences are bigger in collectivist societies? I would say yes, there has been evidence for that. There's also been evidence the exact opposite direction, and there's also been evidence that collectivist societies are more open to overarching identities that then reduce those group differences. So it's hard to make, totalistic claims about collectivist versus individualist societies and which ones are bigger in terms of how they conform to social identity theory. I mean, if I had to put a bet on what the next 20 years of data will say, it would be that collectivist societies, for example, Asian culture, East Asian cultures, would be a little bit more conforming to the principles of social identity theory. But, the evidence is real conflicting so far, so I want to make, measured conclusions from that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, and then we'll move on. So the question is, are there ways in which differences between people can stimulate cooperation? Like, for example, people filling complementary roles or something like that, like different positions on a basketball team or something like that. And I think it's a cool question. It's a very sociological question, a very Durkheimian question. Like, can the division of labor, can group differences cue something like a division of labor, which would lead to greater group productivity or societal productivity? And yeah, I think so. Generally, when you do these small group experiments and you create a group difference that isn't attached to different roles, though, it tends to undermine cooperation and lead to more in-group favoritism and out-group derogation, like I'm saying. But when they've created other sorts of experiments where people have complementary roles in teams, then, yeah, certain sorts of arrangements of complementary roles in teams can definitely facilitate higher levels of productivity. I basically translated what you said into sociology speak, right? That was, okay. So, okay, another study that talks about social identity theory or speaks to social identity theory, you probably remember this graph from just a couple lectures ago, from the obedience lecture, where we were talking about the Milgram experiments and the replications of the Milgram experiment that came afterwards. And in this study, what they did was they took white participants, and yeah, they took white participants and then brought them into the Milgram obedience study, and then the person that they were supposed to teach, the person who's supposed to repeat the word pairs back, was either experimentally determined to be white or black. And this was random. So 50% of the time, if you're a participant in this study, you walk in and you're randomly assigned to have a white victim of your shocks or a black victim the other 50% of the time. And what they found was, in the control condition, just the normal Milgram obedience study kind of setting, the black victim is actually shocked a little bit less on average, though I don't know that this difference is statistically significant. But the normal thing would be for the subjects to shock the white participant, maybe, or the white victim, learner they called them in the study, a little bit more. However, if they arrange to have the learner briefly insult the subject prior to the study, while they're in the waiting room together, like say something insulting, then that triggers, or this is the interpretation, that triggers a basis of group difference, racial differences, and then subjects are much meaner to a black victim than they are to a white victim. Remember, all participants in the study were white. So normally, you know, they weren't showing in-group favoritism. They weren't shocking the white target, the white victim, less. In fact, they shocked them a little bit more. But when something in the situation made these group differences salient, then that led to in-group favoritism and out-group derogation of a rather nasty kind, right? Like electric shocks that might kill the person. Any questions about that? And this is, I mean, talk about, we've come a long way from the minimal group paradigm, right? Like the minimal group paradigm's about 14 and 15-year-olds allocating money based on painting preferences. And you might be thinking, wow, what does that matter? You know, and how does that speak to major intergroup conflicts like wars? But then this one really starts to speak to it, right? You have a group difference that's sitting there that could be active. It isn't having any effect normally, but then one insult triggers that group difference, and then subjects became more likely to essentially kill the victim from another racial group. Okay, questions about that? Okay. Study 4, continuing with the race and ethnicity theme as a basis of group difference. It's just one basis of group difference. Obviously, painting preferences is another one, but we'll go with this one for a little while. Sidanius et al. In 2004 conducted a study at UCLA, which is, I think, one of our satellite schools, and then they found, I've heard of their work. I don't know. I'd heard of them around. They supposedly play basketball. So, okay, so this was conducted at UCLA, and it was motivated by a couple observations that in higher education over the last 40 years or so, there's been this huge increase in racial and ethnic diversity on college campuses. We now have incredibly diverse college campuses, at least in the UC system in California. Can you all please be quiet back there? Those of you who are talking. You, and you. Stop talking now. Thank you. And please don't talk about me telling you to stop talking. Okay. I have to add that one now. It's kind of ridiculous. Okay, so this is motivated by two observations. There's been this huge increase in racial and ethnic diversity on college campuses, but there's still limited intermixing across racial and ethnic lines. There's some, but perhaps not as much as you would expect by chance. People aren't equally likely to interact with people of their own or similar racial or ethnic group as a very different one. Instead, we see great homophily. What's homophily? People tending to like and hang out with similar others. And the homophily tends to be on racial and ethnic lines on college campuses. Okay. And Sidanius et al. Had this idea that maybe ethnic organizations and fraternities and sororities are part of that. Maybe they are a group, or they are available groups that are part of the reason that undergraduate students find themselves segregated into separated social networks. So, but note, obvious caveats at the top. There's good things about frads and sororities and ethnic organizations, yada, yada, yada. I'm not bashing these organizations, nor is Sidanius. Well, I'm really not. I'm just reporting what Sidanius did. But Sidanius isn't either. Note, ethnic organizations have demonstrated positive effects, such as comfort with identity, interaction with faculty, and sense of belonging. They also played a critical role in the integration of college campuses. And then also student groups in general foster social connections and can reduce isolation. So these are great things. But there might be another side to this. And that is that the effects of membership were essentially the same for minority and white students in this study. They found that greater ethnic identification, like when they surveyed people and asked how much do you identify as your racial and ethnic group, people that were higher in this tended to then be more likely to join these groups. So people higher in identification as white were more likely to join fraternities or sororities. People more higher in identification as, say, Asian American were more likely to join an Asian American group, or African American more likely to join an African American group, and so on. And then, in turn, there was a reciprocal effect where membership in these groups then further increased within group identification. So you might join a Latino student organization in part because you're a highly identifying Latino, and then as a result of being in that group later, your identification as Latino relative to those who don't join the organization has increased. Many of you are going like, yeah, that's kind of obvious. Okay. So, but they did research, and they really showed it, you know? So now you can really believe what you already knew. Membership, this is more interesting probably. Membership also led to an increased sense of ethnic victimization. So there was when people would answer surveys saying, to what extent do you feel like your group is mistreated by other groups on the campus, or is mistreated by the university as a whole, or the climate is opposed to your ethnic group, when they had participated in these groups, they tended to answer those higher. Now, note, there's no saying who's right or wrong in answering these questions. These are subjective perceptions of reality. And so who knows? Maybe membership in these groups made them more accurate, and they really were being victimized. I don't know. But the point is that group membership led to an increase in this relative to those who didn't join the groups. And this is interesting. So even people joining fraternities and sororities were more likely, or white people joining fraternities and sororities were more likely to say that they felt that their ethnic group was victimized on the college campus. And then it also decreased a sense of common identity and social inclusiveness for the whole campus. So people who had joined these groups were less likely to say that we, as UCLA students in general, share some common identity. The people who did not join these organizations were more likely to say, or rated, were higher on, yes, we are all, some big group. Questions about that? Okay. Yes, question. So ethnic identification would be a series of questions like it is, so say it was African-American ethnic identification, racial or ethnic identification. They would be like, being African-American is an important part of who I am. Okay, I remembered that one. It is important to me to be African-American, and so on. Questions like that, yeah. Any other questions about that? Yes, sir. They'd be more likely to, or less likely? Right, okay, so yeah, so what predicts joining a racial or ethnic organization that is does not correspond with your race or ethnicity? I don't know. There probably is some research there on that, but I don't know of it. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, so we'll do study 5, and we'll take a break. Study 5, this is one of my favorite studies in this entire class. This is a really good one. Okay, so, and this study was done by Levine et al., and actually the fourth author on this paper is the cousin of Michael Buravoy, a sociology professor here, one of my colleagues in the department, and I don't know, that's just a random thing I'm telling you. I don't know why. But I was telling him about this study, and he was like, that's my cousin, blimey, or something like that. So study 1. And his cousin actually does really, really kick-ass social identity theory research, so he's really awesome. Okay, so study 1. They were interested in kind of like the replication of the Milgram experiment with racial differences that are triggered by an insult. They were interested in how extreme can the effects of social identity theory be. You've had all these lab demonstrations where people were kids or whoever allocate resources in these strange artificial circumstances. What if you took this outside the lab and studied real behavior out there, and then also, more meaningful behavior, like something where people might be getting hurt. This is why I'm getting excited about this study. So in study 1, what they did was they recruited, and they started with undergraduates on a college campus, but I think you'll see that the study ends up going beyond your typical lab study. They recruited football fans from some university in Britain. They were undergraduate students at some university in Britain, and they were football fans, which apparently means that they were soccer fans, and I don't understand, whatever, I don't know. So they were soccer fans, but they called them football fans. Very confusing. And then specifically, they were Manchester United fans. And so they asked people, so everybody's a football fan in United Kingdom, or really everywhere but the United States, everybody's a football fan, and they mean the other kind of football. And they put up these surveys that said, are you like a big football fan? If so, would you like to participate in this study? And, they couldn't, people were breaking the door down to participate in the study. So, but they asked them, what's your favorite team on the sign-up page? And from that from that list, that roster, they just picked the Manchester United fans. So are you all familiar with Manchester United, this team? So they used to be like this really blue-collar team, but now they're like the New York Yankees, of football. I don't know. If you're a Manchester United fan, take that as you will. Or if you're a Yankees fan, take that as you will. So they brought them into the – Nora's the Yankees? Okay, sorry about that, Nora. Okay, I thought you hadn't made a mistake in 4.5 years. All right. You're getting your essays back the week after spring break now. So, okay, so study one. They brought all these Manchester United fans into the lab, and then they gave them a questionnaire regarding how much and in what ways they liked Manchester United, which is a pretty silly questionnaire, but the thing they're trying to do is trigger their sense of group identification. So they have a survey where they're supposed to say, how much do you really love your favorite football team, and then you have to write down the name of your football team, and then also answer on this degree of agreement scale, how much you like them. And so basically, they're repeatedly, as they answer this survey, indicating how much they like their team and writing the name of the team over and over and over again. So there's 50 questions. They keep writing Manchester United. Oh, I love them. I love them. I love them. Okay, so then they're asked to go to another building on campus to complete the second part of the study. And this is really when the experiment starts. What happened then was on the way, they had a Confederate run by, go jogging by, just a normal person acting like an undergraduate student, and seem to sprain their ankle and then trip and fall. That would be a fun job, right? To repeatedly seem to sprain your ankle and trip and fall for independent study credit. Okay. And they had 3 research assistants hiding essentially in the bushes, observing what would happen, okay? So the subjects are headed to another room. They see somebody trip and fall when they're jogging, and then there's 3 people hiding, studying what they'll do, So what happens? Well, we haven't got the manipulation yet. The person who was jogging by, the Confederate, the experimental manipulation was what were they wearing? What were they wearing? They were either wearing a Manchester United t-shirt, or a plain t-shirt, or a Liverpool t-shirt. Okay. Now, if you were British, I guess you would immediately understand that Liverpool is the big rival team of Manchester United. Do you all know this already? I didn't know this. I didn't know this about the Liverpudlians, but I did know that they were Liverpudlians. Because what famous rock and roll band is from Liverpool? The Beatles, exactly. They're Liverpudlians. But anyway, Manchester United, so the person that goes jogging by, the Confederate, who works for a living pretending to sprain their ankle, is either wearing a Manchester United t-shirt, a plain t-shirt, or a Liverpool t-shirt. And they were interested in helping rates. They had these 3 coders in the bushes saying, okay, is the subject going to help the person who sprains their ankle? And they coded the rate at which the person actually helped the Confederate. And so when they're wearing a Manchester United t-shirt, they were very generous, polite, nice people. They would rush over and help the person. 12 out of 13 subjects who saw a Manchester United person sprain their ankle helped them with their sprained ankle. However, if they were wearing a plain t-shirt, only 4 out of 12 helped them, which is absurd. And then, if anything, even worse, if it was a Liverpool t-shirt, only 3 out of 10 helped them. So this one's not so, well, okay, all of this is surprising to me. I mean, I would think that I would help somebody that sprained their ankle or not, regardless of what t-shirt they were wearing. But apparently, if they're wearing your favorite team's t-shirt and you just finished filling out this survey extensively activating your degree of identification with the team, then you're incredibly benevolent and polite and kind to the person that shares your fan identification, and you're really mean to the rival team. But then this poor guy in the plain t-shirt who didn't do anything, maybe doesn't even like football, just gets it just because he doesn't like football enough, I guess. Okay, so then study 2 is the same study, redone in a slightly different way. So now the difference is they're given a questionnaire regarding how much and in what ways they like football, just the sport of football. Not Manchester United. Now they're just having their identity as a football fan activated. And they do the same t-shirt manipulation. Somebody runs by and sprains their ankle wearing a Manchester United t-shirt, a plain t-shirt, or a Liverpool t-shirt. And the helping rates now are, again, they're always help the Manchester United person because they're, a better person. And the plain t-shirt, they don't help. And now the Liverpool's t-shirt, they do help. So, when it's active, I'm a football fan. they'll help the Manchester United fan, they'll help the Liverpool fan, but again, this guy that doesn't like football for no reason, who made the mistake of only having plain T-shirts clean that morning, doesn't get helped. So the idea that they're trying to illustrate here, and it's really like an elegant demonstration, is that different levels of identity can be activated in different circumstances. You know, if we were to have you answer a bunch of surveys about how much you like Manchester United, then you'll help the Manchester United people and you won't help anybody else. Instead, if we activate, your identity as a football fan, then you'll help any football fan, even these Liverpudlians who you usually hate, and you won't help the person in the plain T-shirt. Question? Yeah. Right. Or you? Yeah. You got it. Okay. All right. So let's take a 2-minute break, and then we'll finish the lecture. Okay. All right. If I get your attention, we'll knock out this last study in illustrating social identity theory, and then you'll get your papers or your exams back. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay. So we're gonna do one last study that illustrates the social identity theory, and then we'll pass back your exams outside, and we won't have time to do a quiz today. So, I know, I'm so disappointed. I know, I'm so sorry. Okay. So, the Robbers Cave experiment. The Robbers Cave experiment is the last experiment we'll talk about today. And it was conducted, if I get your attention, please. Okay, it was conducted by Muzaffar and Carolyn Sharif in 1954, also known as the dynamic duo. By the way, last year people actually put that on the test. I'm joking, they're not really the dynamic duo. No one really calls them that. Although, if you remember, there's something distinctive about Muzaffar Sharif and the way that he dresses. And what is that? He wore a friggin' cape. How weird is that? How weird is that? Okay, so this was a field experiment that was conducted in Robbers Cave National Park in the 50s. And what it involved was 22 white middle-class boys. And a lot of this kind of reeks of sort of Lord of the Flies. This is kind of a Lord of the Flies kind of study. So they took 22 white middle-class boys from the Midwest who were age 12, and they wanted to test the following hypotheses. That, and this is like literally their words, the dynamic duo speak now. When individuals having no established relationships are brought together to interact in group activities with common goals, they produce a group structure with hierarchical statuses and roles within it. Okay. If two in-groups thus formed are brought into a functional relationship under conditions of competition and group frustration, attitudes and appropriate hostile actions in relation to the outgroup and its members will arise and will be standardized and shared in varying degrees by group members. This is a fancy way to say if you create even a minimal basis of group difference, groups will come to hate one another. They'll also come to form organizations within their groups that are pretty organized and group-like. And that's basically the big idea, is even minimal differences will create strong differences between groups. So it's a minimal group experiment only in a natural setting with 12-year-old boys in, I think, Oklahoma. Okay, is that right? Is that wrong? Okay, I think Robbers Cave National Park's in Oklahoma. Wherever it is, this is it. This is it. Looks nice, right? Looks good. Yeah, it seems that way until they separate you into groups. Okay. So at stage 1, they randomly assigned people to 2 groups, and they were totally isolated from one another for 5 days, which is an interesting thing. So they take 11 boys and put them in one group, 11 boys and put them in the other, and they don't let them even see each other for 5 days, which is not easy. They're always doing all these outdoor excursions. They're having to keep them separate from each other, keep them totally isolated. And what they had was they had them work on cooperative joint tasks, like, I don't know, whatever little boys in the 50s do at summer camp, like making, like whittling and like swimming and stuff like that. Do y'all know about whittling? Yeah, that's when you take like a knife and you have wood and you whittle. I don't know. I didn't mean, yeah. So it is cool. It's a lot of fun. It's a good time. And they're encouraged to identify as a group. So they're trying to make these 2 groups of boys into real groups. And each group decide to name themselves. And they name themselves the Rattlers and the Eagles, which is very sweet, Okay, so stage 2, they created a competition. These boys hardly even knew that there was another group of boys. They never even saw them, nothing like that. So they tried to create competition. they competed first for a trophy and medals and pocket knives. So they ran a series of competitions where the groups had to compete with each other to get some mutually exclusive prize that only one group could get. It was either, in the first one, a trophy, in another competition it was some medals, and in another it was to get pocket knives. And little boys in the 1950s, I don't know if you've ever read a Hardy Boys book, there's nothing little boys in the 1950s like better than pocket knives. So so they've had these competitions, and they bring them, well, no, it's on the way to doing these competitions. They bring them together after the first competition at a dinner. So they're at dinner, these two groups, they're brought together. They've never really been in each other's presence. They've just done one competition against one another. What's going to happen? They did not like each other. These groups hated each other. They'd been isolated, and then they had one competition. They called each other names. They engaged in razzing, which is 50s speak for calling each other names. And they spontaneously created and sang derogatory songs about one another, which is hilarious. And some of the Eagles didn't even want to eat with the Rattlers. They said, I have lost my appetite. I don't like eating around these Rattlers. I don't like these boys. And then they burned each other's flags. They each had flags. They raided each other's cabins, stole the flags, burned them. They really hated one another. Really hated one another. So the researchers, I don't know why they did this. It's totally unnecessary. But the researchers arranged for the Eagles to win one of the competitions. And in repudiation, the Rattlers stole their medals and pocket knives, which was just what they deserved, these Eagles. And then there was more name-calling. They called one another stinkers, braggers, and sissies. Classic. I'm having horrible flashbacks from preschool right now. I know. Stinkers, especially. I would always get that one. I don't know why. I never figured it out. And the fighting, it almost got physical between these 12-year-old white boys from Oklahoma. They were almost physical. They would, when they walked past each other in public spaces, they would hold their noses and be like, you know how those Eagles smell. They're such stinkers. And they refused to eat with one another because of the smell or something like that. I don't know. Okay, so they just hated one another. Just group isolation, a little bit of competition, and they had decided that the other group, it was just evil. So then, at stage 3, they tried to integrate the two groups. They were interested in, can you just bring the groups together into the same environment, and that'll fix everything, you know? And you can imagine some other, efforts to do this in the 50s. Right? We'll just put them in the same place, everything will be better. Okay. So for 6 to 7 days, they did the integration phase. And they had several opportunities to reduce tension. So they did a bean collecting contest, obviously. I don't even know what that means. A bean collecting contest. What could that possibly mean? Okay, but they did it. They also showed a film. I tried to find out what film it is. I can't find out what film it is. Knowing me, I would, of course, try to figure out what film it is. They got to shoot firecrackers off on July the 4th, all this stuff, where they got to be in each other's presence and do these things, next to one another, together, technically. And they were thinking maybe this will help, but no effect. Several of these events ended in vicious food fights. And it did not undermine the animosity between the Eagles and the Rattlers at all. Vicious food fights. So then they were like, okay, this is not working. We isolated them. We made them compete. They decided they hated one another. And then we tried to just put them in the same environment doing stuff together, and that really didn't work. They still hate one another. So then they tried to create some scenarios with superordinate overarching goals. So you remember one of the ways you can create a superordinate identity that brings groups together that had previously been at tension is to have them work on a common task together, right? So if they can work towards some common goal, then these non-trivial problems, solve non-trivial problems, then they'll come to like each other. So that's what the Sharifs tried to test, was this idea. And this is the first big demonstration of this idea. So they had some non-trivial problems that would happen at the summer camp, which could not be solved by any one group. It would require, if these problems were going to be solved, the two groups to work together. So what were these? First, the water problem. The researchers intentionally blocked a critical water faucet at this cabin camp place. I don't know if you ever went to one of these lodges or whatever. I never did. My parents wouldn't send me to these. But apparently they're very nice, and the water is always going off. So the researchers intentionally blocked this critical water faucet, and they blamed this on the vandals. So the vandals came in the middle of the night. That you can imagine these kids being woken up, right, and being like, oh my God, the vandals have come and shut off the water. They've blocked a critical water faucet. We have no water. And no one group can solve this problem. You will all have to work together to restore water and undo what the vandals have done. Ridiculous. But the boys were like, okay, we're ready, you know. And so the boys cooperated together, and they fixed the water faucet problem. And then after that, briefly after that, at lunch, or no, when they went to go get the water, after getting the water going again, the rattlers let the eagles go first. They were like, you guys go first, because you don't have enough canteens, and so you need more water. So, I don't really get this, but anyway, it was this emergent nice thing the rattlers did, where they're like, you guys need some water, you go first and get them some water. So that's, getting a little bit better. They don't like each other that much, but it's getting better. Second, they have to go get a movie together, and obviously 11 boys alone can't get the movie. So I don't really understand the details. The researchers suggested they watch Treasure Island or Kidnapped, but they said, this is why it takes more than 11 boys. They said it would cost $15 to get the movie. I mean, this is going to be a great movie, Treasure Island, Kidnapped. It's going to be a lot of fun, but we're going to need $15. Okay. And the groups were like, okay, neither of us has $15, but together we'll split it evenly. We'll split it evenly. Even Steven. And so they cooperated to get the film, and this was despite the fact that the Eagles were depleted in numbers because a couple of them had to leave because they were homesick. I know, right? It's like the sweetest study in the history of social psychology. So there were other joint tasks. They had to use rope on a partly cut through dangerous tree. They were like, oh, this tree has been partly cut through, probably by the vandals. We'll need to use rope to pull it down or else someone will be injured. And the boys are like, we can do this, you know. And they worked together. And there was a truck that was stuck in a rut that was carrying food for both groups. I mean, how would you not see through that one, right? But they didn't, and they worked together. And the results were that group relations were incredibly improved. They started to eat together. They started to sit together at dinner. This is getting beautiful. They decided they wanted to return to Oklahoma City on one bus, and they cheered when the staff okayed this and gave them permission. There was mixed seating on the bus, and at a rest stop, the Rattlers decided to spend the $5 they'd won in the bean toss contest on malted ice cream shakes for everybody. Okay, that's it.